Good morning or good afternoon, wherever you are in the world today. My name is Steve Hall. I'm Director of Content and Community with Procurement Leaders, and I'd like to welcome you. We have got a great webinar for you here today. We're going to be talking about how you can become best friends with finance and treasury by sharing your goals. We have partnered with Taulia to bring you this event. We're very excited to be talking to them, and it's a subject that's very close to their heart, as you can imagine. And we have invited one of their excellent members of staff to come and talk us through their point of view. We've also got another great speaker from the world of finance to kind of bring this to life and to try and offer a different take. We've heard a lot of procurement talking about how procurement can think differently. But what does finance think? What do we think from a technology point of view? Let's try and bring that to life a little bit. I should say, and I will repeat this throughout, this is a live webinar here today. So if you are listening live, please feel free to enter your questions through the platform. You should be able to see a Q&A box on there at any time today. Don't wait for us to hit an obvious Q&A mark. At any time today, do let us know that that you're listening and that you have a problem that you'd like to share with our panelists today. Okay, so without further ado, let's understand who our panelists are. So I mentioned we've been partnering with Taulia. We're joined today by Chris Cawley, Head of Working Capital Solution Consulting. Chris has 20 years experience helping the world's largest corporations optimize their working capital. He interfaces daily with corporate treasurers, CFOs and VPs of finance in support of their strategic working capital improvement goals, and specializes in software solutions focused on yield-producing dynamic discounting programs and or free cash flow improvement projects via third-party funded supply chain finance solutions. And what I think is particularly interesting there is, and we're going to get into supply chain finance, but it's understanding, and this is something Chris can bring to the table, understanding the point of view of the treasurer, the CFO, what they need and how these solutions can help, and what procurement needs to know better about how they can get involved and what they need to be doing. We're also very excited to be joined by Andy Sawyers, former editor of Financial Director magazine, Eurofinance and chair of Financial Directors Summit. Andy works very closely here with us at Procurement Leaders, and we're delighted to have him on board for this. He is an award-winning business and financial journalist and editor whose freelance work specializes in matters relevant to procurement function professionals as well as finance directors and CFOs. So Andy is great for kind of straddling that divide and helping us get a clearer picture of just what makes that relationship tick. He's a thought leader on cash, treasury and risk management, and has chaired conferences and discussion panels for corporate treasurers in many parts of the world. So delighted to welcome both our panelists today. I've kind of alluded a little bit to some of what we're going to talk about, but I really want to hone in on a couple of things. And the question really is, how can we use the metrics at our disposal? How can we use the levers that procurement has, and you, the audience, the levers that you have at your disposal to try and improve this relationship? Finance and procurement often want some of the same things, and in theory you'd think it would be an incredible relationship, often with procurement reporting into finance, but frequently we find that isn't such. Procurement will often list, and our research bears this out, CPOs will often list finance as their most important relationship, and yet there's often this divide. Often it's a case of cost savings are the top priority as passed on by finance, but procurement doesn't necessarily see that as something that they're able to bring into their priority mix because they want to build relationships with suppliers. Or, for example, there might be questions around cash flow. How can procurement optimize cash flow whilst at the same time thinking more strategically about its own objectives? And really getting that balance right, meeting the stakeholder needs without destroying your plans and relationships with suppliers feels like it's still, even after years of discussion, it's still at the forefront. It's still something that procurement needs to fix. With automation, with Industry 4.0, with the advance and the more maturing aspect of the supply chain finance technology, there are options. There are ways that procurement can approach this, but it requires understanding of finance need. It requires a change in mindset, often in procurement, and a careful deployment of some of these processes. So let's hear from our panel. Let's learn a bit about what's at our disposal. How can we do things differently? And just as a reminder of before I hand over to our esteemed panel, just a reminder of the excellent interactive tools available. We would love you to submit your questions at any point throughout the webinar using that Q&A box there. You'll be able to find the resources. You can see those on the side, and if you have any technical questions there, please do check out the help section. So I'll leave it up for just a moment before we move on to the Q&A. But I'm very keen to hear from our first speaker, and let's kind of dig into this topic because it is an exciting one. So Chris, maybe as a good starting point, maybe you could just kind of paint a picture, tell us a little bit around who you are, and tell us a little bit about Taulia.
Yeah, sure. I'm Chris Cawley, and the head of Working Capital Solution Consulting here at Taulia. So what does that mean? I've been with Taulia for about 5.5 years, and spend my day in the field talking to CPOs, CFOs, treasurers, VPs of finance about their working capital strategies. Depending upon whether it's the procurement leader looking to bolster relationships, normalize on payment terms, be focused on margin goals, or whether it's more treasury, talking about working capital needs strategically. That's the role that I've been doing for Taulia for the past 5.5 years. And then, of course, translating that down to the platform and the opportunity of how Taulia can help complement their strategies, their goals, because every single one of the corporates that we work with has got many different strategies already in play. E-payables programs, they may be doing an existing supply chain finance program with one of their tier 1 banking relationships. They may have card programs. There's a litany of different strategies that are already in play. And how can we complement and drive further those strategic goals? So that's a little bit about me. Prior to Taulia, I was with GE IT Services, now Genpact, an outsourcer across procure-to-pay, order-to-cash, and record-to-report, and focused on automation. And going back to CGI consulting days in my earlier years. And so that's a little bit about my background, and looking forward to this conversation and answering many questions.
Great stuff, and Chris, and it kind of helps explain why you're such a good person to talk about this topic, and why we're pleased to have you here. Let's talk about let's get into this then. Procurement and finance. The relationship has been picked over a lot, but I guess why is it still something that is almost a bit of a mystery? Why does procurement not necessarily understand how to talk the language of finance? What do you think are the main barriers there in terms of understanding what finance wants and what the main objectives and priorities are there?
Yeah, no, that's a great question and a great intro. And procurement, as you said, is responsible for the relationships, responsible for sourcing efficiently, responsible for getting the best price around products and or services, et cetera, and maintaining those strategic supplier relationships on a day in and day out basis. They have a very intimate relationship with the suppliers, and which is extremely important. Treasury/finance, on the other hand, what are they mainly focused on is managing cash and working capital needs, and Treasury is really focused on risk mitigation in the supply chain and across the company. And so it is common that if the two aren't talking, if the two aren't discussing common goals, that there could be a disconnect, and we find that very often. So one of the things that we like to do is when we're talking to procurement and or when we're talking to finance and treasury, we always make sure that the other is represented in the calls and the meetings so that they can listen and learn about what the strategic goals are. Because at the end of the day, if you draw a line up from the CPO and or from Treasury and or VP of Finance and or CFO, there really are common strategic goals that they're all working towards. And it could be around a particular cash goal. A common one is, hey, Chris, from a cash perspective on the finance and treasury side, we need to gain visibility to $100 million and improve working capital. And so they're very focused on the balance sheet. Or it could be even more strategic. They could be a common goal around improving return on invested capital, or a common goal around improving overall gross margin or net margin. So again, when you draw a line up one more layer and you get to the CEO, CFO, et cetera, CPO. There really are common goals. And we also like to explore not just the metric and or the number, but say the metric is 100 million or 500 million in improved working capital. Well, what are the strategic uses? Like why? What are the strategic reasons behind those common goals that really need to be shared and articulated with both organizations, so everybody's marching to the same beat, if you will. And it could be around improving their debt ratios. They want to improve their overall debt to EBITDA ratios for credit rating improvement. It could be that they have strategic uses of the cash around M&A, around maintaining upcoming large debt repayments, interest payments. There's so many different uses, capital expenditures, large outlays that are coming around the corner. But there has to be alignment from procurement and or finance. I mean, procurement has got all the relationships with the supplier. It could be strategic goals around supply chain health, and that's a very common one. And listening to the supply chain and their working capital needs. I mean, we're talking a lot about the corporate's goals on the buyer side, but there's also another set of goals on the supplier side. And with every purchase order that goes out, there's a fulfillment activity on the supplier side, and they need to be able to meet those orders, perform those services efficiently. And they have working capital needs as well. So again, procurement owns that relationship with the supplier, and when procurement and treasury or finance are in lockstep, these are the absolute best programs that we're seeing across our customer base. And procurement becomes a critical component in the monthly reviews of the metrics against the business case, with treasury and finance right there as well. So yeah, those are some of the key elements of alignment, and we always try to draw the parallels up the food chain to get to the common strategic goals, uses of cash and or working capital and or margin, whatever that is. And then everybody's aligned. That flows into a business case, and then that gets reviewed monthly and or quarterly so that everybody's course adjusting appropriately.
So let's kind of dissect that just a little bit, because I mean that to me sounds like that is an ideal scenario. That's what needs to happen, and that makes a lot of sense. As you said, alignment here is critical. So I'm going to share two things from a procurement leader's point of view, but I also want to kind of hear from you. Maybe we can talk about why isn't that not happening. So let me just share a couple of things first. I'm going to refer to one of the comments made on our Collaborate platform. A VP from a European manufacturer says that one of the key success factors for them in having better budget transparency was to agree the savings methodologies with finance and have them sign off the realized savings so they don't have to debate after the fact. And then to basically have that kind of sign off on every particular level of the metrics that they were going to use, signed off way in advance so that alignment was happening. Right from, there were no arguments after the case of what procurement delivered or what the strategy should be, because they were agreeing on those metrics and sharing those in advance. But again, that doesn't seem to be necessarily the norm. It doesn't seem to be always that relationship with finance is there, that they can have such transparency and such kind of clear linkage with the business goals. And what we see actually, if you look at procurement functions, the way procurement leaders maps out maturity of procurement functions, we find that a huge percentage, and we're talking in the region of sort of 80% here, of procurement functions are struggling to kind of live in that world where they are this key networking point between the needs of suppliers and the needs of stakeholders, and find themselves rather kind of running around putting out fires essentially and playing a much more reactive role rather than being involved in all the strategic activities they might. They aren't necessarily mature enough to say, we understand the business objectives and we can take you right through, and to use your kind of terminology, that right back down and say, we understand the business objectives and here is how we're behaving in order to kind of enact those in terms of a procurement environment. There was just a few thoughts, I guess, that me sharing why I think, we know what should happen, but it doesn't always happen. What from your point of view, what do you see from talking to your clients? What challenges prevent that alignment? Where are they tripping up?
Yeah. No, that is a very common scenario in the beginning where they are and can be somewhat siloed. But one of the best practices in the highest performing programs of Taulia's customers is the drive for this iterative review process. It's one thing to set a goal that's kind of like the North Star that everyone's driving towards, but you have to have incremental checkpoints. Literally, in the early stages, it's weekly, and then maybe, as you're ramping, it's monthly, quarterly, etc. But everybody has to have the visibility and, most importantly, the data to look at how are we progressing toward our goal. And if it's reduced cost of goods sold and it's a margin focus, everyone's focused on the income statement, net income, or gross margin numbers, or whatever that goal is, that's great. But all along the progression, there has to be iterative checkpoints that say, okay, here are actuals compared to the business case goals that we're all marching toward, and make sure that that's happening. A lot of times it doesn't. A lot of times it's just kind of set it and forget it, and there isn't the cross-communication on a regular basis. Oftentimes procurement might have a goal to just go capture as many discounts as possible, or drive spend to a rebate program, a V card, a P card, a single-use payable structure, what have you. And there's lots of different programs in play, but again, having that iterative approach where everyone's always coming back together. Again, in the beginning, it's a weekly cadence, and then monthly, and then certainly on a quarterly basis. A lot of times the metrics aren't available. The reporting isn't available, and that's a critical component. And one of the things that we really specify with our methodology is looking at the network behavior, looking at the trends, looking at the actuals, understanding supplier behavior, and then course correcting and going back to procurement saying, hey, this is what we're seeing with this supplier segment, this is what we're seeing with this other supplier segment, this is how we're driving to working capital improvement or the margin goals, and always coming back and bringing treasury and procurement together. So yeah, that is absolutely critical, and we do see that in the beginning. The other thing that I'll offer up is that a lot of times procurement isn't asking treasury or finance what are their goals, what are their hurdle rates, what are the available sources of liquidity for a potential early payment program if that's what they're focused on. And then vice versa, treasury sitting down with procurement and doing a robust supplier segmentation analysis and understanding spend categories, understanding payment terms associated with supplier segments, and mapping out a strategy on a very fine-tuned segmentation basis. So it's both of those organizations paying attention and asking the questions and probing to make sure they're aligned to those strategic goals. And yeah, I think those are some good insights.
Yeah, very useful. Just I do want to bring Andy in a moment, but just a couple more questions here. One would be, okay, so again, you've explained what needs to happen. But what if, for example, the CPO doesn't report into the CFO? What if there is that disconnect with finance? What does procurement need to do to kind of think differently to make sure that those finance metrics are kind of baked into their objectives? If it's not de facto that they would be, how do they need to change?
Yeah, if it's not de facto and there's not a drive from the CEO or the CFO to bring the parties together, treasury, procurement, finance, etc., it needs to happen. I mean, there has to be proactive attention to make that happen. And in every one of our programs, it's a requirement that the procurement leads and the finance/treasury leads are sitting at the table together. If they're not, we absolutely correct that, and because there are such dependencies on both organizations. And so I would encourage you from a procurement perspective to reach out to your finance managers, your assistant treasurers, your VP of finance, et cetera, and have the conversation, around their goals, their drivers, efficient uses of cash, and or what are they looking to achieve from a margin or working capital improvement perspective, so that the alignment can take place, and vice versa. Treasury can reach out as well and make sure that they're aligned to what procurement is trying to accomplish in the supply chain. So there has to be proactive attention, and more often than not, it really is being mandated from the CFO, CPO, and or CEO are bringing the groups together. I mean, when we go into meetings nowadays, there's other constituents as well that are part of that. But always procurement and procurement/payables, accounts payable. That's an important constituent as well, to be part of the operational efficiencies that drive, towards the goals as well. How quickly is the procure to pay, transactional food chain, transactional processing to make sure that early payment opportunities have a robust window of opportunity. If in fact the goal is to do an early payment program to drive the margin and or potentially the working capital improvement on the back end. So we really see it changing in the market, and we see these parties coming together, being mandated to come together so that everybody's in alignment. And if it's not happening, if it's not happening, I would be proactive, and I would be an innovator, and I would, reach out and have those conversations. Yeah.
I suspect we're going to come back to that, a few times. It does feel like there is an urgency driver here for some organisations. But I wanted to kind of land on that last piece. I mean, we talked about the importance of aligning the metrics there, but let's, maybe you can paint a picture of what you see as some of the levers. What are some of these that procurement has to kind of more effectively meet the needs of finance and treasury? I mean, you started talking around the P2P system, and that's that's quite an obvious interface there. But let's, we can talk about cash flow here as well, right? In terms of influencing cash flow, procurement has got opportunities and has got ways of kind of upgrading what it's doing. The only thing I would say here is, and of course, before we get too optimistic, is that realistically, the thing that you experience from outside the commercial world is when you see in the news such and such a business has extended its payment terms, and you think, that's probably because finance has decided they need some more cash. Procurement, you're going to go and make that happen, and you're going to manage the fallout with the suppliers. It just seems like a very blunt tool. What do you think functions need to do? What levers do they have? What can they upgrade? And are some of them more sophisticated than simply just putting out the payment terms?
Yeah. So, the levers from a cash improvement or working capital improvement perspective are pretty straightforward. And from a procurement perspective, it's all about DPO or weighted average days to pay. Obviously, there's inventory, and then there's DSO on the receivable side. And so those metrics are really the key metrics when it comes to managing and improving working capital. But if we talk about DPO, days payables outstanding, this really is the primary lever that procurement manages and influences on a day-to-day basis. And oftentimes procurement is trying to get suppliers on standard payment terms. Many of our customers do entertain a term extension program. Many of them don't. Many of them it's more about supply chain health. It's a corporate social responsibility program. There's lots of different strategies that procurement is responsible for that pull different levers. But if we stay on the cash program, if it's all about cash, if it's all about improving working capital, then procurement is really the primary seat at the table, talking to suppliers and talking to them about the payment term programs. If they're entertaining a payment term extension, maybe moving them from that 30 to 60 or 45 to 60 or 90 or whatever is within the norms for their industry or within the norms for their country or their geography, then you're right. It can be a very challenging scenario where the only lever is we're pushing terms. And, honestly, that's going to be tough. And, we've seen scenarios where ultimately can result in bad press, and it's just not a road that you want to go down. What needs to happen if you're going to entertain something like that is an early payment opportunity. And, having the flexibility to, let's just say there's excess cash on the balance sheet, and there could be a term extension program, but at the same time, there could be an early payment program. You can leverage that excess cash to pay early to drive margin. You could also use third-party facilities or cash to pay early, and that's along the guise of reverse factoring or supply chain financing. A lot of that flexibility is in the market with lots of platforms today, and so procurement and or treasury really sits down and does the segmentation, does the analysis, tries to figure out what are the flexible approaches, and in concert with a supply chain finance program or in concert with a self-funded early payment program to make that happen. The other key component is the supplier, in the supply chain. It has to be a very attractive value proposition for them. You're pushing payment terms on them, and they've got their receivables carrying costs that they're looking at day in and day out, and DSO metrics. And so, if it's just one-sided, it's going to be very difficult in terms of maximizing adoption to that term extension. And so we really work with corporates to have a very simple, very easy to onboard, very pleasant experience with early payment offers to suppliers that are more attractive than any other alternate source of financing available to them. And when that happens, it really becomes a win-win scenario. Suppliers have got a very simple onboarding experience and gain access to visibility into their approved payable early payment offers. Procurement and AP need to make sure that the payables are being approved as efficiently as possible. If a good analogy is, say you're pushing a supplier from 30 to 45 days or 60 days, but it takes you 45, 50 days to receive, match the invoice to the purchase order, receive the goods and or services, and approve the invoice so it's sitting there ready to pay. Well, the window of opportunity for an early payment is very small and a lot less attractive to a supplier. So, again, procurement, and I'm going to kind of lump in, payables to that as well, accounts payable, need to work very efficiently so that the invoice is being receipted on day 3, on day 7, on day 10, so that a very attractive early payment offer can be made to the supplier. So having that flexibility and ability for the supplier to have a very seamless, very rapid onboarding experience so that they can meet their cash flow goals is critical. And as opposed to, again, Steve, what you were saying, which was kind of a one-sided, hey, we're moving you to 90 days, take it or leave it. We've seen that movie so many times, and those corporates realize the challenge because they get very limited uptake in the term extension. They're not achieving their working capital improvement goals, and they come running back to say, hey, look, we need to offer the supplier a very flexible early payment program to cater to their cash needs as well.
Absolutely, and as you say, there are solutions here, but obviously the change has to be more holistic. It has to be process, technology, culture, mindset. There has to be a lot of things that change. So I think it's a really interesting story, and hopefully, if you're sitting there listening and you can kind of relate to some of the challenges we've been discussing, we'd love to hear from you. If you have any questions for our panel, anything that maybe you want to share, something that you're kind of going through that you want some insight into, please do get your questions across, and hopefully we'll have a chance to put them to the panel.
I can offer up one other common scenario, just to throw that out for the audience, and maybe it will resonate. Is if you're entertaining a supply chain finance program, let's say the goal is improve working capital, you're focused on cash in the balance sheet, and you're entertaining a term extension program, et cetera. A lot of times corporates will, via treasury, will go to their bank relationships and they'll say, okay, we want to do a traditional supply chain finance program, bank-led, and the bank's going to third-party fund early payments to suppliers, et cetera. One of the things that we see in the market regularly is that might be relevant for the top 25, 50, 100 suppliers, large suppliers, where there's a lot of spend. But if you think about the supply chain and what procurement is managing day in and day out, that value proposition needs to be extended down the spend curve into the medium and or smaller suppliers, which could have significant importance, maybe not as much spend, but still significant importance, where the need for cash is even greater when you're talking about the mid and I'll call it the long tail of suppliers. And so again, having a flexible, strategy, early payment program and platform, when you talk about the technology, you need to make sure that it's a seamless experience, not just for your top suppliers, but to all of your suppliers. And I think that's a real critical component. From the supplier that I make an analogy, I say the supplier that you purchase your annual holiday, Christmas tree from, potentially, it's up to your most strategic supplier that you're doing potentially billions of spend with on an annual basis. So that's very critical, and that's really where the market is right now, is offering these flexible early payment programs across the board, and while you're entertaining a potential term extension program or continuously working on your strategic cash goals.
Absolutely, and that's something we've seen reflected in a lot of the conversations we've seen in our network. They are looking at what other options do I have here? What ways do I have to kind of implement these early payment programs? What else can we do to kind of incentivize suppliers to kind of work with us if we have to look at payment terms being one thing? What are our options? And I think it's quite interesting to see that play out. I know that I'm very keen to bring in Andy here, so Andy Sawyers. We'd love to hear a little bit, Andy, particularly around kind of you've got a very interesting take on that, the balance of procurement and treasury, and you've seen things from both sides. Maybe you can kind of give a little bit of a background on yourself, just so people are kind of familiar there.
Well, thanks, Steve. Yes. I've been a business journalist for about 25 years. I've spent about half of that time as editor of Financial Director magazine, which is a publication that goes to finance directors, CFOs in the UK. I've worked in treasury publications. I've worked in legal publications. And I've been working with procurement leaders for a number of years. And one of the things that really strikes me, when I was talking to finance directors, time and again they would say, how can we be seen to be adding value? We're not just sitting here as bean counters. And I come to procurement leaders and I talk to procurement people and they're all saying, how can I be seen to be adding value and deserve a seat at the table, and we're not just here to screw our suppliers on the price? And I've talked to people in accounting firms, and they say, how can we be showing that audit adds value? I talk to general counsel, and they say, how can we be seen as being more than just the guys who put contracts together? And the fact of the matter is, over the last 25 years, I have seen all kinds of people in all kinds of corporate functions banging their heads against their own corporate silos. Now, fortunately, those silos are cracking. In many cases, they're tumbling down, which is great news. Some corporates are much further ahead than others. and sort of there's a gradual rebuilding of the relationship between these different functions. And here we're talking obviously predominantly about between procurement and finance, between procurement and treasury. And so, the next stage, I guess, is people sort of being careful to not step on each other's toes. Go get that cleared with treasury before you do anything, or find out what procurement are doing. But the next level really, and the best level, is to actually be proactively helping each other to add value. I mean, Chris used a very good phrase about being an innovator and being proactive. And one of the key things that I've come across time and again that has helped to break down these silos and to actually rebuild these relationships is a very simple four-word phrase: find out and show how. You find out what it is the other function is having to deal with, what their issues are, what their agenda is, and then you show how you, in your function, can help them to achieve their goals. And we've talked a lot about goals. I mean, goals and KPIs, absolutely vital. It's all very well, talking about the corporate goals, but for anybody who's got an important role and a function, critical issue is what are you wanting them to do, and what are you paying them to do? What are you rewarding them for doing? What are you giving them a clap on the back for doing? And so it's really important that these goals are absolutely aligned to what the corporate strategy is. And there's all kinds of ways of doing this, like balanced scorecard and everything else, but ultimately these goals have to be absolutely aligned. Totally critical is to make absolutely sure that you're having a really good in-depth conversation and really understanding each other's agendas to make sure that what you're being praised for doing, rewarded for doing, is actually the things that you are supposed to be doing for the good of the organization.
Okay, and that's some very good points there, and we've had some questions in from our audience around that, so maybe we'll pick those up in just a moment. But a question for you first, Andy. We touched upon the cash piece at the moment, and I'm kind of interested. This is going to sound a bit of an odd question, but why is it procurement's problem in a way? I mean, obviously you said we have to align to the objectives here, but cash is pretty cheap at the moment. So why is it a problem? Why does procurement need to be thinking about how they're going to approach having a strategy to improve cash flow?
I think it's important that procurement understands that cost is not the same thing as cash. You can buy stuff at a certain cost, but until the cash goes out the door, there isn't actually a cash impact as such. But procurement really needs to understand, why the two are not exactly the same. If you've got a supplier that says, okay, look, I'll do it for you at this price, but if you can pay me in 14 days, it's so easy for procurement to say, yeah, that's great, no problem, we'll get that sorted for you. Because procurement is then going to sit there and say, fantastic, we've got this at a really, really good price. Treasury then finds out that they're going to be paying this supplier in 14 days rather than 60 days. So that creates a problem further down the line. Or there may be a conversation where procurement agrees to do a purchase in a different currency and doesn't actually speak to Treasury about how to hedge that in the meantime. But the fact of the matter is, I mean, although in a sense at the moment it looks as though cash is cheap and plentiful, that's really only the case for the largest, best quality organizations with the best credit ratings. Smaller organizations, cash can actually be quite difficult to get hold of, or it can be expensive. And so if your supplier is finding it difficult to get access to cash, that creates an extra cost burden on the part of your supplier. And it's a cost burden which, as Chris was explaining through various supply chain finance programs, that's a cost burden that procurement is very well placed to alleviate from the supplier. That takes cost out of the supply chain, and that is going to benefit the buyer, the buying organization, and the supplying organization. Interest rates are from this level probably only going to go up, I would say. Interest rates go up and down, but they're probably only going to go up, and that's going to have a greater impact on smaller suppliers in coming months and years than it is on larger organizations. And so really, everybody needs to understand that cash is actually not just something that Treasury looks after or finance. Cash is something that is everybody's concern. Nobody wants to get paid in IOUs. Salespeople don't get their commission paid in IOUs. Everybody gets paid in cash. Cash is actually the thing that, at the end of the day, pays the bills, builds value, is returned to shareholders. So cash is actually everybody's concern, and it's really, really important that actually people across the organization have a pretty good understanding of the vocabulary of cash and what they can do about it. If you give me just a second to give you one really good example. We've talked a lot about working capital, and people like Chris and I mean, we bandy about the phrase working capital 500 times a day. Now, the CPO probably understands what working capital is. The deputy CPO probably understands. If you scratch much further down that level, how deep in the procurement function do people really understand what working capital is and what the implications are? Because working is a good word, capital is a good word, so working capital's got to be a great thing, don't you think? No, because working capital is stuff that hasn't yet been turned into cash. And that's something that an awful lot of people don't understand, and if they don't understand it, they will make bad decisions, or they'll have inappropriate conversations with suppliers. And so really that's why cash is absolutely something that everybody in the organization has to be trained to thoroughly understand.
Yeah, I'll follow up on that. Just to echo that point, I really, think it's important that, the procurement organization should take a class in Finance 101, and or Treasury 101, and vice versa. And so that when we're using terms like working capital improvement, everybody understands exactly, what we're talking about. And so just education and awareness. And frankly, Taulia, we spend a lot of time educating procurement and or Treasury about the nomenclature and about the impact of the balance sheet or the income statement, the common alignment to uses of cash, strategic uses of cash, and just getting everybody aligned. But you're right, when you talk about yield, when you talk about margin improvement, working capital improvement, everybody needs to be aligned, and education across the organizations is critical, absolutely critical.
Really appreciate the addition there. I mean, you guys, you're passionate about this. It feels like, this idea of having a 101 would it would solve a lot, but yet I'm interested in, is the motivation there in a sense? Andy, can I come to you on this one just for a moment? I mean, it sounds a bit glib to say, but why should Treasury or Finance care about suppliers? Apart from how much they're charging them, what kind of weight they are on the bottom line. One thing I would posit, Chris made the point around it might be a business objective to understand your supply chain health better, and I think that starts to kind of answer the question. But maybe you can give us that perspective. Why, what is going to, what's changing there? What's changed? Why are Treasury or Finance likely to care more about suppliers?
Well, I think we're seeing a bit of a sea change over the last 5 years and certainly over the last 10 years. If you go back to the days, certainly before the financial crisis, very large organizations would quite happily push out their payment terms to their small suppliers and quite frankly just let their small suppliers deal with it. That was their problem. Organizations are increasingly realizing that actually that creates risk in the supply chain. It creates financial vulnerability in the supply chain. It creates instability, and it's Treasury and Finance are coming to realize that swapping out suppliers one for the other is actually expensive and it's risky. And those are two words that people in Finance and Treasury really don't like very much. The other thing is this is a societal issue and a government and regulatory issue. People are very, very conscious when what they perceive as large organizations beat up their suppliers, for lack of a finer phrase. And that's why we're seeing things such as late payment legislation. We're seeing prompt payment codes that organizations can sign up to in the UK, across Europe, really around the world. We're seeing all kinds of new legislation, regulation, codes, all of which are designed to drive out a bad practice towards suppliers and to sort of drive forward with best practice towards suppliers. So I think finance and treasury are actually realizing that and especially in a world of increasingly intricate supply chains, that is a very delicate balance that you disturb at your peril. And so just hammering down on the price is no way to treat that incredibly valuable asset that you have, which is your very own supply chain. They say that it's supply chains that compete, not individual organizations. And I think that's a realization that is coming to the fore now.
And I think if that mindset change kind of echoes throughout the company, then that really does kind of change everything, really. So there's a very interesting dynamic potentially emerging there. Guys, we've had some great questions in. If you are listening and you have a question you'd like to put across, just type it into the chat box there, and we will hopefully have a chance to answer that. But I want to throw a couple of the ones that we've had in at our panel and see what they can do with them. Let's go to you with this one first, Chris. So I'm going to kind of read this one straight out. Would it not be easier just to pay your Christmas tree supplier in, say, 5 days, rather than having him and yourself go through the ordeal of a supply chain finance program setup? Same for all small suppliers. I think there's a bit of a challenge there for you, Chris. What's your take on that? Would it not be easier? What's your thought?
So, no, I don't think it'd be easier, and it might be counter to your cash goals that you're after, using your excess liquidity on your balance sheet to pay suppliers early. In today's supply chain finance programs, innovation and automation has done incredible things to the supplier experience. And today, a supplier, your smallest supplier, medium supplier, largest supplier, honestly, it takes them about 90 seconds to join a third-party funded supply chain finance solution. And so it really is not burdensome. I think that this person who probably submitted this question maybe has had some experience with maybe some traditional onboarding programs where there's significant analysis and send me your financial statements and certificate of encumbrances and let me talk to X, Y, and Z, and it takes 3 months to get a supplier onboarded. That's not the case with today's innovative platforms. It's a very streamlined, very straightforward, very simple click-through process where the supplier is accepting some online terms and conditions and et cetera, and away they go. Then they have visibility to their approved payable early payment offers. And so it's a very rapid process, and it's available to the smallest of suppliers all the way up to the largest suppliers. So I think that,
there you go.
Yep.
No, that was a succinct answer. Hopefully that's helped our listener there. Andy, I want to throw this next one your way, please. I'm going to read this out. Our listener says, good discussion about best practices. What does the finance community see or need from procurement in the future? Is there something that we're not doing well enough to drive those objectives? We've talked a little bit around what we're seeing right now. What do you think about what the finance community might see coming down the track? What's your thought there, Andy?
I think above all, what procurement needs to do is to be taking the conversation beyond cost and on very much onto the value agenda. So what does that mean? Well, it's hard to pin this sort of thing down into the sort of numbers that finance likes to talk about. But really, procurement needs to be talking, for example, about the innovation, for example, that suppliers have been bringing into the organization. They need to be talking about supplier satisfaction with that buying organization. They need to be talking about the extent to which their organization is actually a customer of choice for suppliers, because that's the sort of thing that is going to really help drive the organization forward at the top line, never mind the bottom line, because it's going to be able to give the organization exclusive access to innovative ideas and products and services that they can get out of their supplier base. We all buy from Microsoft, for example. I mean, you're not going to get You're not going to get groundbreaking innovation from an organization such as Microsoft that all of your competitors don't also have. But you can get that sort of innovation from smaller suppliers. Now, it's a very important point that actually came out of a Procurement Leaders Insight white paper, which we will be publishing shortly in association with the very good folks at Taulia. And I spoke to a couple of people from the finance side, and they're absolutely clear about how important the relationship with their suppliers is in terms of driving the business forward, getting that innovation. Absolutely critical. So the more that procurement can have that kind of a conversation and less about, oh, we've saved you another 37 cents per widget that we buy, then that's absolutely all to the good.
Yeah, and I'd like to add...
If that is what's happening, that's powerful stuff. Chris, what do you think?
Yeah, I'd like to add strategically, what can procurement do further, right, in the market today? And oftentimes we see this where procurement's done a great job negotiating early payment discount terms, right? 115 net 45, a single cliff, a double cliff, which is great. But we'll still, when we look at the spend file, we see 5% of spend under negotiated discount term, maybe 10% if it's a good program. And or they've done a great job, getting spend onto a rebate program, single-use payables, V-card, P-card, buyer-initiated payment, whatever it is. But it's still, it might be 3%, 5%, of spend, et cetera. But then procurement may feel like, they're plateauing. It's like, oh, we've tried so hard, and this is really all we can do. But again, with today's early payment programs and the flexibility and the applicability to the entire spend curve, from smallest all the way down, all the way up to the largest, procurement can re-engage in a strategic segmentation analysis and say, look, we know that there are these other initiatives out there of ways to efficiently reach all of the suppliers in the supply chain. Let's sit down with Treasury. Let's understand what cash is available. If it's, I'm kind of on the theme of discount capture now. So maybe there's excess liquidity. The treasurer and or VP of Finance say, hey, look, we're all about margin. We've got all of this cash. We'd like to earning peanuts in our short-term investments and our savings accounts and risk-free mutual funds, et cetera. Let's use that cash at or above this hurdle rate, if you will, to go drive further margin. And so it's re-engaging, and we keep using the term, let's be proactive. But there's no need for procurement to feel like they've plateaued and there isn't more, because there's a lot more that can be done. The other thing is that procurement, at the end of the day, a supplier is going to take an early payment to drive whatever your objective is, whether it's a margin, you're self-funding, or whether it's third-party funding and there's a term extension, yes or no, whatever. But a supplier is going to take an early payment not based upon rate. There's a very important decision. Number one, it's based upon their cash needs, right? What are their DSO goals? What are they trying to accomplish? What are their working capital cycles? And procurement is closest to that relationship. Procurement can understand the supplier's cost of capital. Procurement can understand the supplier's needs, and oftentimes, people just think, oh, it's just rate. It's got to be the lowest rate, and that's going to drive behavior. That's absolutely not the case. And so, at the end of the day, what Taulia is doing is we're having literally supplier by supplier negotiations and conversations so that we understand what their perspective is and to keep them whole, and what does a very attractive early payment offer look like. And procurement is critical in that. And again, these flexible solutions today allow procurement to do so much more with that supplier relationship.
Okay, let's build on that. So we've only got a few minutes left, panelists, but I do have, there's a question here which I think both of you could offer an interesting viewpoint. So Andy, I'm going to go to you first, but Chris, I very much want to hear what you have to say on this one. So I'm going to read this kind of first part out. It's a very long question, but I think in the interest of tackling one piece, we're going to go after one piece of the question. Thinking about bigger businesses and how procurement can drive value beyond cash, does the panel feel P2P efficiency and automation matter? Andy, do they matter? What do you think?
Yes, absolutely. And there are two immediate thoughts that come to mind on this. The first is P2P automation ultimately helps you to pay your suppliers more quickly, to be able to pay your suppliers more quickly. Now, if you want to pay your suppliers on day 60, that's fine. We can understand that you've got working capital needs, you've got cash needs, fine. But if you are able to pay them on day 10, that creates a 50-day window in which they can take advantage of an early payment facility. If you can't pay your suppliers until day 50, it doesn't matter what sort of an early payment facility you might put in place because you can't pay them until day 50 anyway. So the sooner you can actually get your suppliers' invoices ready to go, the better. The other thing that is very, very common with P2P platforms is that the ability for suppliers to see exactly where their invoice is, has it been signed off, when is it going to get paid, and if they can get sight of that through a platform without having to phone up accounts payable and start hassling them, then that's absolutely all to the good. That creates information. We've talked a lot about the supply chain. We've talked indirectly about the financial supply chain, the flow of cash, and actually allied with this here is the third supply chain, which is the information supply chain.
Great.
Yeah, I would echo that.
It's a good question, Chris. I want to hear what you've got to say here. Go for it.
Yeah, so when we're talking to whether it's the treasurer or VP of finance or procurement, and they say, here are our goals, return on excess liquidity or improve working capital, the next question that I start probing is I say, that's wonderful. Talk to me about your procure-to-pay process. Talk to me about your approval cycle time. Talk to me about some of those KPIs and metrics as enablers to an attractive early payment program, because you got to have the procure-to-pay efficiency and visibility and automated matching and workflow for routing and approval efficiency. You have to have all of those components in play and streamline transactions into, at the end of the day, your ERP. If that's not there, as Andy just said, it is absolutely going to eat into your greater value proposition of yield and/or improved working capital. And so, Andy started talking about supplier self-service portals, so the supplier can see the status of their invoice at any part of that food chain, eliminating a lot of the common inquiries coming into procurement and payables. Supplier information management solutions where suppliers can self-serve address change requests and bank account change requests and other types of things like that is absolutely critical in driving just overall supplier management efficiencies and procure-to-pay efficiencies. And so that's, e-invoicing. I don't think anybody's talked about that yet, but when you get down to that component, it's absolutely critical, and there's a lot of global compliance requirements around electronic invoicing in different regions of the world in different countries, but it's absolutely critical. Now, at the same token, if procurement and/or payables AP said, Chris, we do everything manually and it's all paper, and we're approving invoices in 5 days and they're ready to go, okay. But we would still say, look, there's a lot of operational efficiencies that can be driven out of your cycle time and out of your transactional food chain here. Let's focus on those as well. And all of our best practices customers are doing that. They're all employing these procure-to-pay automation tools and capabilities. as an enabler to some type of an early payment program.
Excellent. Guys, the hour is nearly upon us, so unfortunately for those who we didn't get a chance to answer your questions, those will be made available to our panel so they can follow up post-event with you, but thank you for submitting those all the same. Just a couple of final thoughts then. That we've heard about the need to be proactive, to reach out to finance. I think there were some kind of, I guess to me, some kind of glimmers of hope in that things might be changing in terms of the drivers to improve the relationship between procurement and finance. But ultimately, procurement has to have those business objectives in sight. It has to be making full use of the tools available. We've heard of the importance of automation, etc., so that you can use them as an enabler to then implement some programs that you've got to better improve relationships and cash flow at the same time. We've heard about the opportunities in terms of early payments, supply chain finance, and also we've heard about some of the challenges as well. And procurement shouldn't lose sight of the need to kind of get in early and get agreed with their colleagues in finance and treasury on how they're going to behave and what they're going to do. So a lot of very interesting takeaways there. Hopefully you got something from this discussion. And just to follow up on Andy's point, please do keep your eyes out for the follow-up we will be having from a white paper we've partnered with Taulia on around working capital management. That will be forthcoming very shortly, and we'll make sure that you guys are made aware of that as well. So all that remains for me to do is to first thank our speakers, Chris Corley from Taulia and Andy Sawyers, former editor of Financial Director magazine. Delighted to have you both join us here. Thank you, of course, to Taulia for partnering with us on today's event. And I'd like to thank you as well, the audience, for joining us and making this an exciting and engaging discussion. Thank you very much, and please do join us again next time.